Hey, so hello everybody. I'm Dr. Zoe Enstone and I'm an associate professor at York St John University. I've put my contact details on that first slide. I'm on what I still call Twitter, but X has at Zensto. So if you want to ask me anything or if you have any further interest in this beyond today's talk, you're very welcome to get in touch. So the title of my paper today is Fright Nights, Arthurian Ghosts and the Medieval Ghost Story. So in particular today, I'm going to be looking at ghosts in two medieval texts. So I'm a medievalist and I also have interest in medievalism, so that ongoing impact of the medieval after the medieval period. So that's quite a wide span of things that I'm interested in. And I think that's probably reflected in today's paper, which is mainly situated in looking at medieval texts in their medieval context, but also at the end, I allow myself a little bit of time, hopefully, to think about some of the longer term impacts of that development of the medieval ghost story and the Arthurian ghost in particular. So today, I'm going to be talking particularly about a couple of key texts. I will somewhat meander around a few other ghost stories to give a bit of context, but mostly I'm looking at two particular ghostly apparitions in two particular texts. So the first of these is the Haunters of Arthur at the Turn Watherlane, which is the Adventures of Arthur at Tarn Wadling. And Tarn Wadling is a real place in Cumbria, in the northwest of England. It's now woodlands, but it used to be quite a substantial lake. And what's really interesting for us in our consideration of the ghost and the situating of the ghost in this lake is that this is a location that's really associated with the supernatural. So it's sometimes known as the lake that cries, and Gervase of Tilbury in the 13th century Otter Imperialia describes the mysterious sound of bells at 7 a.m. each morning in this area. Later traditions also link the lake to a giant. There's also supposed to be a mysterious island that appears in the center of the lake and then disappears again. But sadly, as I say, the lake is no more and it's now woodland. But this is also a location that we see that is associated quite a bit with Arthurian myth, particularly those narratives involving Gawain, particularly Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where I've taken the image that I popped on the slide, because sadly the Haunters doesn't have its own image, but I wanted us to have a bit of a picture of Gawain on there because he's also the central character of the Haunters, despite its title indicating that it should be more about Arthur. So the Haunters is written in the 14th century and is Middle English alliterative verse. It survives in 4 manuscripts, and they're completely separate manuscripts, which is interesting for us if we're thinking about this as a text, we're thinking about the transmission of the text. A lot of the time with medieval manuscripts, because of course they're all handwritten, we can trace a kind of chronology of manuscripts which are influenced by each other. In this particular instance, these are 4 completely unrelated manuscripts that come from different areas of England. There's no connection between them. We can't see that they're copies of each other. So that means that we're looking at the absolute minimum 4 different trails for this work being copied and shared. And that means that given how much we know doesn't survive from the medieval period, we know that this is really popular as a text and very widely circulated, which of course makes us think about then the use of a ghost in such a popular text. So we'll also be having a look today at Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, which is written by Sir Thomas Malory while he's in prison. It's completed in 1469 or 1470, thereabouts. We only have one manuscript of this text, but only a few years after it's written, in about 1485, William Caxton produces a printed version, and this is very widely circulated, and it's incredibly influential on the development of Arthurian myth after the medieval period. So both of these texts, in their own context, are hugely influential, very popular. So I think a really good starting point for us to think about Arthurian ghosts because of the impact that they both will have had. So I wanted to give a bit of a sense of the context of these texts as a starting point for thinking about how they're using ghosts. And I'd start by saying that Arthurian romance is huge in the medieval period. It's massively popular. One of the questions I often get asked when I'm teaching Arthurian myth is whether this is based on reality. So is King Arthur real, or was King Arthur real? Unfortunately, I think the answer to that is probably no. The earliest documents that include King Arthur are several hundred years after the events that after the time when he was supposed to have been alive. So there's a little bit of a gap where he's not really mentioned, and then he kind of appears in these chronicles. So I think the likelihood is he wasn't real, but if he did exist, he probably wouldn't have been the King Arthur that we would know and recognise today. It's likely that he would have been the leader of a war band and not the kind of king of the Round Table with all of those features that we might recognise from the present day. So all of the knights, Guinevere, the sword in the stone, all of those kinds of aspects that we might expect wouldn't have been present if he was a real person at some point. So even though we can assume that he wasn't real, we can also see this huge movement of texts and development of different texts across the medieval period. These stories are incredibly popular, and they're imagined and reimagined across hundreds of years in a range of languages. I don't want to say an international phenomenon because unfortunately the context of this particular period of history is that we're largely talking about Europe or present day Europe, but across Europe there are texts in every language that include elements of the Arthurian stories. And what we find is that over time these stories shift and change and develop. We get new knights added to the Round Table, we get different areas of interest, and these stories really take off. So I've put a few key examples on the slide for you there, some of the big names and some of the key areas or the key texts where these stories begin to gather the elements we might recognise today. But it's almost impossible to come up with a comprehensive list of every single Arthurian text because there are hundreds and hundreds of them in this period. There's also a bit of a mixture in the way that these texts transform. So as I've said, we have these elements that get added to the story. We have a focus on different knights across time. But we also find that there are a number of key elements and moments that remain consistent in the mythology, even where the texts don't refer to them directly. So what I often say to my students is that the Knights of the Round Table are a bit like the medieval equivalent of superheroes. If we think about Batman, we know this character exists across comics, films, television, a range of other media. And even if we don't interact with these forms directly ourselves, we still have a sense of the character, what he looks like, what his costume's like, and some of the key elements of the story, because it's such an influential part of contemporary culture. And although different texts interpret the figure differently, there are elements of Batman's character and background that remain consistent and act as a reference point. So I'm thinking, for instance, that we know that Batman's parents are murdered, and that's this key developmental moment for him. That's what prompts him to become a superhero. So even where that particular episode isn't directly used in a version of Batman's narrative, it's kind of there below the surface, influencing what happens. And we have exactly the same with the Arthurian Knights and the stories of the Round Table. There are these key moments that are so influential and so important, even if that particular text isn't looking at that particular moment, there's still it kind of bubbling along below the surface. There's an awareness that that's where the text has come from, that's what's happening, and that's why some of the things have developed the way that they have in the stories. And we'll circle back round to this a little bit later on, because this has a big impact on how these ghosts are used in the two narratives that we'll have a look at today. So, in addition to being very well known for knighthood and chivalry and a sense of adventure, the medieval romances are also immersed in the supernatural. If we go back to my Batman analogy, superheroes often need supervillains, and we see the knights facing up to terrifying foes like giants and dragons. However, the supernatural also pervades these texts through many of the characters themselves and the events that happen, and they offer a bit of a different type of battle for the knights, not just a physical battle, but often there are moral issues to consider, challenges and complexities to what the knights believe in as a result of these supernatural elements. So again, I've put a few examples, almost impossible to include everything given the range of Arthurian romances. But we see, for instance, werewolves. So I've put a few examples of texts with werewolves on the slide. So Marie de France's Bisclavit, the Lay of Melion, and also actually mentioned in Malory's Morte d'Arthur. So Sir Maroc is just as an aside, it's mentioned that he's a werewolf. We also have famous fairies, and I couldn't even start to list the number of texts that include fairies in the medieval romances. So I just named them. So Morgan Le Fay, Sabine, the Lady of the Lake, Melusine, just as a few examples of some of these really iconic fairies. I particularly like Melusine, so I've included an image of her. She is cursed by another fairy, her mother, to spend every Saturday transformed into a serpent from the waist down. So that's the image we have on the slide, just as an example of some of the magical goings on in the romances. And that kind of leads me to my last point there, which on the slide, which is that magic is just everywhere in these romances. It infuses every element of these stories. So what I wanted to kind of think about then is in this genre, in these wide-ranging and diverse narratives, which deal with magic and the supernatural and the miraculous, which I haven't even really talked about, but of course there's an added layer here where we think about religious beliefs and miracles involved in that. So I think I may have already mentioned the Holy Grail, but if I haven't, that's a whole other set of Arthurian texts that think about the miracles around the Holy Grail. So what's really surprising in texts that are very comfortable navigating these supernatural or magic spaces, that we don't see more of the use of ghosts in these narratives. They're not figures that particularly appear that often. So I wanted to also then think about what relationship those Arthurian romances and the kind of lack of ghosts had to medieval ghosts more generally. And I think what we find then is that the romances are a little bit unusual. So certainly in the early medieval period, there are some religious concerns about narratives about ghosts and how these might fit into a Christian framework. But as we reach the latter part of the medieval era, we see that developments in navigating what happens after death means that ghost stories become much more widespread. So drawing on the work of scholars such as Jean-Claude Schmitt and Jacques Le Goff, Make Hildebrandt has explored these developments in the light of changing ideas about purgatory. And in particular, he notes, from the late 12th century onwards, there are three places for the dead: heaven for the saved, hell for the damned, and purgatory for everyone else. Purgatory was in essence a concept of hope, since even if a person committed sins during his or her lifetime, he or she could still be among the saved at the moment of the last judgment. So I think what's important for our consideration of ghost stories here is another point that Hildebrand makes about the nature of purgatory, that it's not just a place where you account for your sins. The actions of the living can also have an impact on the duration of your punishment. If you can get the living to pray for you, or get masses said, then this can have a direct impact on how long you spend in purgatory. So this conceptual space and motivation for a return of the dead to visit the living forges a much more direct connection between the living and the dead, and removes some of that religious tension around the existence of ghosts. ghosts can actually reinforce a really clear sense of some of the risks of sin and act as a warning for the living. So this stops being something that undermines the concept of heaven and hell, and instead reinforces that Christian framework of belief. So in medieval literature and culture more generally, we can see that ghosts are often used very explicitly as a way of exploring this idea of purgatory. For example, in the Ghasts of Gi, which centres around a didactic dialogue with a ghost from purgatory, on which I know Sam has discussed in an earlier video in the Ghost series, we see that direct engagement with the ideas around purgatory and what this is, and why the ghost is back and visiting, and really using the ghost as a tool to inform the living about what purgatory is. And in addition to disembodied voices, like the ghost of Guy, who warns verbally about the afterlife, the physical form is also central to some of these ghostly encounters, and act as ongoing reminders of what lies beyond life. The memento mori reminder of death appears across art and literature of the medieval period. So one of the famous examples is a text called The Three Dead Kings from the 15th century. And in this story, three kings get lost in the mist and then encounter these three horrible skeletons who reveal themselves to be the king's three ancestors, and who berate their descendants for how they've forgotten these ancestors and are no longer saying masses for them. So these characters, who I imagine look something like our lovely figure there on the slide, these characters are directly accusing the kings of prolonging their time in purgatory by not taking these actions around saying masses, but also act as this reminder of the inevitability of death and what these three kings might face when they do eventually die. And our cheery little image on the slide here is a memento mori with a banner that reads, "Memento homo quod sinus es et in cinere reverteris." Remember that you came from dust, and from dust you will return. So there's really this kind of tradition of a reminder about death, and the iconography attached to that. I'm afraid I can't describe all of the range of fascinating ghost stories that warn of the dangers of sin and the horrors of purgatory, but hopefully these couple of examples have started to give you a sense of how ghosts were often used to support the Christian structure and beliefs at the time. However, ghost narratives don't always straightforwardly adhere to these Christian ideals. So we know that there were ghost stories before the church had developed this idea of purgatory, and that facilitated their existence within that Christian belief system. And there are also ghosts who don't fit into that straightforward model, that adheres to this idea of a return from purgatory to reinforce religious values. So I'm thinking, for instance, of a work called the Lady Trot of the early 13th century. And this tells a story that we also see repeated in John Gower's Confessio Amantis of the late 14th century. So this is a story of a knight who is off out on his adventures and sees this procession of people on horseback, hundreds of people on horseback, who are kind of in groups. And the first group, their horses are kind of ambling along, they're paired up, they're happy, they're having a lovely time, they look very comfortable, they're well dressed, just generally having a lovely, lovely time out for a ride in their pairs. As we get to the final group of people in this procession, we see a very different experience. So these people are in two separate groups, men and women. They are not dressed in the same kind of finery as the people towards the front of the queue. They are miserable, they are lamenting, and their horses are moving at a trot. So instead of a kind of gentle amble where people are very comfortable, they're being juddered around on horseback. So our knight is able to speak to one of these women, who explains that the entire procession is made up of people who are dead, and their experiences in this procession are connected to how they lived in life. So the happy people at the front served love, whereas the unhappy people are those who scorned love during their lifetime. So this sounds a little bit familiar to us. This kind of idea of punishment after death for particular behaviour does sound a bit purgatorial. But what we find here is that the central figure is this personification of love rather than a set of Christian values. So I think there's that interesting moment of the kind of shift in focus for this text that moves it slightly outside of that really clear purgatorial return kind of ghostly narrative. And of course, what our knight does in this text is he takes this information back to the court, in particular to inform the ladies of the court that this is what awaits them if they don't serve love during their lifetime. So I think we can see that religious belief and the way that it changes across the medieval period is hugely influential in the development of ghostly narratives, but it's not the only influence on the development of ghosts. So where does this leave us with our Arthurian legends? I think still rather surprised at the lack of ghosts in the Arthurian narratives, because actually, at the core, Arthurian myth is all about death and return. If you think about the title of many of these works, and certainly Malory's influential text, this is all about death. La Mort d'Arthur is the death of Arthur. We can also think about one of the key features of these Arthurian narratives. When Arthur dies, there's generally a bit of ambiguity over his death. Often in the stories, he's taken away to the Isle of Avalon. His death is maybe a little bit vague. And there's a sense that, much like a ghost, he might return. There's kind of there's a sense that he's not quite a zombie Arthur, but there's a sense that he's not entirely dead at this point. Some texts are more specific about the fact that he has definitely died and give him a grave. But even there's often sometimes a bit of ambiguity. So the famous inscription on his grave states, Hic jacet Arturus, rex quondam rexque futurus. Here lies Arthur, who once was king and shall be king again. And this leads to the more modern version of this, the once and future king, which you might recognise from the famous series of books by T.H. White. So this is how Arthur is remembered across the medieval period. That blurring of fiction and reality, that confusion sometimes over whether Arthur's real or not, also plays a part here. So there's a genuine belief at some points and for some people in the medieval period that King Arthur is real and King Arthur will return. So this notion of Arthur as a king who is dead and not dead is really pivotal to the way that he's characterized, and also to the way that some of these texts are put together. Because, of course, in order to return, Arthur does have to die or no longer be available. So that inevitability of the fall of Camelot is really intrinsically built into the development of character and the development of the narratives. So you might think then that this focus on the permeability of death might lend itself to an array of ghostly appearances and interactions, but this isn't generally the case. So when we do see these ghostly figures, they do make an appearance, I think we have to think really carefully about the significance of those appearances and why the authors have made this seemingly unusual decision to include ghosts in their narratives. So this leads us back to thinking about the Haunters of Arthur. And I mentioned already, although it's called the Haunters of Arthur, the Adventures of Arthur, it's not actually Arthur that sees the ghost in this story. And the text instead focuses on Guinevere, Queen Guinevere, King Arthur's wife. She's actually referred to as Gaina in this particular text, but I'm going to call her Guinevere just so that we're consistent across the references across Arthurian texts more widely. We also have Gawain, Arthur's nephew, who also sees the ghost, and the first part of the narrative where this ghost story appears mainly focuses on those two characters. And that positioning is quite important in the text. The text is often seen as one that's split into two distinct parts. The first part focusing on the interaction with the ghost, the second part moving into a more traditional Arthurian fight, really, an Arthurian test of valor for the second part of the narrative. And I'll talk a bit more as we go through about this split and what that means for our interpretation. So the ghost sits in that first half of the text, and there's this build up to this ghostly encounter. So the court are out on a hunt. It's all a lovely day. And then the weather means that Gawain and Guinevere are separated from the group. And then we hear that the day became as dark as if it was murky midnight. And a figure emerges from our supernatural lake that I mentioned earlier, which is now a fiery lake. And this figure is in the likeness of Lucifer, most hated in hell. So in terms of the ghost story as a form, Julia Briggs has noted the centrality of the concept of uncanniness, and talks about the importance of ghosts as being in some way a simulacra of human beings, thinking about how this enhances the fear that people might feel at the appearance of a ghost, but also this kind of duality of the physicality of a ghost, but not the human, but not human. That kind of duality as being somewhat terrifying. And we see that with the appearance of this ghost. So we've heard already that it's in the likeness of Lucifer, but actually this grisliest ghost is truly horrific and isn't even identifiable as a woman initially. So we find out that she is in fact a woman, but isn't identifiable immediately. So she's described as being a black to the bone, all covered in clay, with glowing sunken eyes, and being bitten by an array of serpents and toads. I'm sure you'll immediately notice the similarity to the Memento Mori figures that I mentioned earlier, and that kind of really shocking and skeletal physical appearance. There are also visual connections here to the idea of purgatory, and the notion of specific punishment for specific sins. So the fact that it's toads and serpents that are kind of biting her, and we hear about one of them kind of biting her head through this text, are really important in terms of our interpretation of this figure, because those attributes, that kind of association with serpents, is particularly associated with the punishment for lust or sexual sin. So even before we find out a bit more about this ghostly figure, we're immediately being presented with this notion of purgatory, and also this kind of gendered notion of purgatory. Ruth Mazo Karras has noted that by the later Middle Ages, lust is considered a sin that's particularly significant for women. And Joan Ferrante has explained that this association with lust supposedly had a physiological rationale. So she tells us that woman was held to be more given to lust than man because she was thought to be in her humours more cold and wet. So even if we think about the personification of lust, luxuria, this figure is often female, and the iconography here is her as being kind of intertwined with a serpent. So we see this, there's a particularly famous carving of luxuria in the chapter house vestibule of Salisbury Cathedral. I've included an image here from Herod of Hohenberg's Hortus Deliciarum, in which the lustful are punished in hell by flames and serpents. So you can just about make them out in the top left of this image, the serpent kind of twined around several of the figures here. So when this figure appears and we hear this description, we already have these associations with purgatory, with punishment, with sin specific to a particular gender. And the shock continues in this narrative, as much like the story of the three dead kings that I mentioned earlier. This isn't a random apparition. This isn't just some random ghost. This ghost is Guinevere's mother. And she explains her appearance is because of a state of perpetual punishment, which she is subject to as a result of her sins when she's alive. So having established this kind of state of terror through its appearance, the ghost then imparts a range of warnings which span the personal, the moral, and the national. So firstly, the ghost urges Guinevere to ensure that she's offering the masses, again, much like the three dead kings, These masses will alleviate her ongoing torment in purgatory and allow her soul to be brought to the bliss, and for her to kind of alleviate some of that suffering. Secondly, and supported through the tangible demonstration of the impact of these purgatorial punishments, the ghost demonstrates a concern over Guinevere's behaviour, emphasising the importance of charity and chastity and the need to avoid pride, especially in Guinevere's role leading the court. And finally, and in response to a specific question from Gawain, the ghost provides a cautionary message regarding the downfall of Arthur's court, once again emphasising the issue of sin. These messages are intrinsically linked to the relationship between Guinevere and her mother, and also to Guinevere's status as a queen. The ghost's impact is magnified because she represents not only Guinevere's potential future, but also the potential future of all individuals who succumb to sin, and thinking about this kind of both within and beyond the text, giving that message to a more general readership. The ghost herself actually encourages this idea of the link between her and Guinevere. She says, "Muse on my mirror," so kind of see me as a mirror of your own future. So if we think about this idea of sin and the ghost's embodiment of the consequences of sin, it's notable that the ghost is being punished for the same sins that Guinevere herself exhibits. So Barbara Goodman has talked about this kind of sexual sin of the ghost. And the ghost herself talks about her sexual love, pleasures, and delights as part of what she got up to when she was alive. Now, although it's not explicitly explained in this text, this is referring to, somewhat like our Batman analogy from earlier, to these kind of fixed events that the audience would have been aware of from the wider Arthurian romances. So although we don't have this story in the Aunts of Arthur, we know as readers that there's traditionally an illicit relationship between Guinevere, King Arthur's wife and queen, and Lancelot, one of King Arthur's best knights. So we have, therefore, Guinevere's mother in a unique position within the text to warn against the sin and also to exemplify the punishment for that very sin. So we can begin to think about this as a prompt for a bit of a broader contemplation beyond that familial bond as well. So she brings attention to Guinevere's role as queen. She talks about the responsibilities that Guinevere has as queen as well, and gives her a bit of steer about her behaviour. So she asks Guinevere to take responsibility for setting an example to the court. She talks in particular about Guinevere showing charity and how important that is in her role. One of the other main focuses of this part of the narrative is that Gawain also asks her specifically about the issue of knights conquering other lands. So he worries about their actions at this point, which is interesting because obviously Gawain traditionally is a fighter and would excel himself in those kind of situations. The ghost responds that Arthur is too covetous, linking this idea of individual sin to the wider actions of the court and the Round Table. The ghost offers bleak predictions for the future of the court, which the reader knows are inevitabilities given the wider Arthurian tradition. The ghost predicts King Arthur's death and also tells us that a child is already born who will cause the downfall of the court. So for those of you in the know, that's Mordred, who is Arthur's illegitimate and incestuous son, and he does indeed cause the downfall of the court. So the ghost's focus here is to offer, by way of warning, a small amount of hope, but also longer term and beyond death, the offering some hope through Christian redemption. So the transient nature of human life and the need for urgency in relation to repentance and improved behaviour are amplified by that combination of the horror of the ghost's appearance and the experience of torment that she portrays. So in the second half of the text, we see critics are somewhat divided as to the impact of what the ghost advises, with some saying that Guinevere doesn't really change very much at all, others saying that there's elements maybe that she changes. What we see at the very end of the text is that Guinevere does ensure that those masses are read for her mother. So there is at least one positive outcome and a bit of a recognition, I think, of the importance of thinking longer term about her mother's soul, and therefore hopefully about her own soul. So with the Onters of Arthur, we can see that although this is unusual for an Arthurian text, the appearance of Guinevere's mother does align with what we know of ghosts and their significance in Christian belief in this period, and also that this is carefully situated alongside those memento mori traditions and depictions and the wider notion of purgatorial punishment and its connection to specific sins. Which leads me to my second example, which is a little bit less traditional and maybe a bit more complicated in some ways. So this is one very short episode within a huge work. Malory's Morte d'Arthur is immersed in a wide range of Arthurian traditions. So Malory gathers stories from lots of different sources and compiles them into this huge compilation of Arthurian myth. But it's not quite as straightforward as that, because Malory rewrites things, he adds some stuff of his own, he makes some fairly substantial changes to make this rambling array of things somewhat more coherent, arguably. So what we find is that we have the appearance of Gawain's ghost to King Arthur. It's situated at a really carefully positioned point of the text. So having established Camelot and the idea of chivalry, Arthur has been really successful as a king. We've heard about the exploits of a range of knights. But at this point in the text, these ideas have started to unravel, and we begin to see the downfall of Arthur and the fall of Camelot. Gawain's death is a result of fighting within the Round Table. So it's a wound inflicted by Lancelot that actually kills off Gawain in this text. And his ghostly appearance is positioned just before the final battle of the text, and as we know as readers, King Arthur's inevitable death. So Malory makes a few changes to this episode, and I think he makes it a bit more explicitly ghostly. So there's a focus in the earlier text on this being a bit of a dream. Malory instead changes up this episode so that it's a bit more ambiguous. So he talks about Arthur not necessarily being asleep, but he says he fell on slumbering again, not sleeping nor thoroughly waking. So he's kind of in this in-between state. And there's a real emphasis on the fact that Gawain is dead at this point when he's talking to Arthur. This appearance also moves beyond the tradition of purgatorial ghosts because this visitation is from heaven rather than from purgatory. So Gawain is accompanied by the spirits of the women that he saved when he was alive, and they're visible reminders of his good deeds. He explains that God has given him special permission to bring Arthur a message, to bring him a warning, in fact, as a result of all of these women that he saved when he was alive and their intercessions for him. So we've got a bit of a different sense here, and this moves a bit beyond this notion of there being a kind of transition between the living and the dead who are in purgatory, but heaven and hell being a bit more sealed off. And we instead see a figure here who returns from heaven. But I think this is still fairly clearly situated in that framework, because Gawain is given very special permission to come back. This isn't an everyday occurrence. He's very careful to talk about this as being an exception. So Gawain warns Arthur that he shouldn't go into this final battle, and he's very clear with Arthur that that will lead to the downfall of Camelot. As we know, of course, this is an inevitable part of the story, and unfortunately, Arthur does get dragged into that battle, and it is, in fact, the cause of Arthur's death and the end of the Knights of the Round Table. So what's interesting for us here is that Gawain is Arthur's nephew, so we have that family connection again. We can also see Gawain as really embodying some of the core values of the Round Table, and this being an endorsement, this permission to come back from heaven as being an endorsement of those values. So again, this is very much, both texts are very much positioned around thinking about morality, but also very much thinking about Arthurian morality, what it means to be a good Arthurian knight, and what the values are around that, and what these figures maybe need to change to ensure that they are being good Arthurian knights. So I wanted to finish up really just by saying, with my medievalism hat on, that I think for both texts we can consider this positioning slightly later in the medieval period when the ghost is a bit more acceptable as a figure in literature, but we can also begin to think about the impact of this for the ghost story more generally. So one of the things that I think is really important is the positioning of these texts within a ghost story tradition. There's sometimes a tendency to see later ghost stories as being entirely separate from anything that happens in the medieval period. Not, of course, romancing the Gothic, which looks at a really wide range of ghosts and ghost stories across history. But some literary scholars tend to kind of separate off and think that later ghost stories are very different to these medieval texts. And I think when we begin to analyse some of the specifics of these Arthurian romances and the ghosts within them, we can see that there are some really interesting interplays and relationships between that tradition of the ghost story and how it's reflected in these two texts. And maybe we can start reading that ghost story tradition as including some of these medieval texts and thinking about how the significance of those ghosts within the Arthurian romances is obviously, of course, specific to the period, as is every other literary text we look at, but also share some interesting interplays with the modern day. And as we were getting into December this morning, and it's been so cold and frosty, I was particularly thinking about the Christmas Carol, where we have Jacob Marley, and he has this almost kind of purgatorial set of chains around him with all these different elements on it that relate to what he did wrong in his life. So they talk about this chain with cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. And this kind of visible idea of this kind of purgatorial punishment for a character in life. And also, of course, another classic, The Muppets Christmas Carol, where we have Marley and Marley, who are embodying that similar punishment. So I think even if, I mean, I know I have cherry picked one very tiny example from a more modern period, but even those examples kind of start to show that interplay between the medieval and the modern, and this evolution of the ghost story and what that means across time. So I guess just to finish off, I'd say just to give you a warning, really, if you happen to be wandering around in Cumbria and you get separated from your group by a lake, and if the sky goes a bit dark, you might want to consider running unless you're prepared to encounter a gory figure with glowing red eyes who might make you worry for the future of your soul. Thank you.